Hello, human biology students. I'm hoping that this will be the wrap-up video for this unit, and we'll look at some assessment things next week over this material, and I'll keep you posted what that's going to look like. So, cardiac cycle, so today I'm going to talk about that cardiac cycle and kind of the regulations within the heart and how things are regulated. So we already talked about this, the path of the blood through the heart, but this just shows it during the different kind of phases of a heartbeat, if you will. So we're going to talk about diastolic and systolic and blood pressure in today's lecture. But we kind of already talked about this. So on here, remember that veins are represented in blue. So this is blood that's coming from the rest of the body and being transported into the heart, and it comes in, goes into this atrium, gets pushed during a heartbeat, during the heartbeat phase, into the ventricle, and then the next phase it's pushed through this valve, and these, remember, go out to the lungs. Right? This is still deoxygenated, even though it's gone to the heart and through the heart. It has to go to the lungs to get oxygenated. And then it consecutively at the same time, the blood that, as this gets pushed out to the lungs, obviously the blood that was in the lungs getting reoxygenated now gets pushed in through the atrium and then through the ventricle on this side. And then the final phase is it gets pushed out to the different parts of the body. Okay, so this is oxygenated blood being pushed out to the body. Remember, blood's never blue. We just represent it with that blue when it's deoxygenated so that we can tell it apart, but it's really always red, different shades of red, but always red. So and again, this is just kind of what is showed on that last diagram. The systole is the atria, the top part of the heart contracting, and then the ventricles contract after the atria contract. So we call this the systole, and then the diastole is the rest phase. And so when we measure blood pressure, we measure systolic phase and diastolic phase. And so you get two different numbers, like 120/80 or something like that. Heartbeat on average 70 times a minute. It varies a lot. It varies by age. It varies by whether obviously you're working out or at rest, and it even varies by how athletic you are. If you're very, very active when you're at rest, your heart has learned to be pretty efficient, so it's even a little bit slower for you if you're an athlete. Internal control. So internal control, you have an SA node in the right atrium, and that's actually what initiates heartbeat and causes the atria to contract. Remember, these are electrical impulses. And this is why if the heart stops beating, there's sometimes with the use of an electrical impulse, they can start it beating again. So they kind of trick this SA node into starting back up. So this impulse reaches the AV node, also in the right atrium, and sends the signal down to the AV bundle and the Purkinje fibers that cause ventricular contraction. I will not ask you to know this, but I think it's worth mentioning. But I do remember when in the chapter 10 we talked about tissues and how cardiac tissue is unique, looks different than the other types of tissues, and specifically because it has those intercalated discs. Remember, we talked about that, intercalated discs. And if you look, you can see there's one right there, that intercalated disc. So it's like this, it always reminds me of like a cell wall of a plant cell, like that's what it looks like on a microscope. But it's just this very defined line that you see in cardiac tissue. So the impulses travel between these are actually gap junctions. So if you had Gen Bio with me first semester, we did talk about cell to cell communication, and gap junctions are one of those intercellular junctions where communication happens between cells. So our cells are constantly communicating with each other, and none more so than here in cardiac tissue. So cardiac tissue is what we refer to, cardiac muscle tissue is involuntary muscle, right? We don't really have to tell our heart to beat. Thank goodness, that would be a lot of extra stress, and those of us who are forgetful might forget to tell our heart to beat. So it's important in our lives that the heartbeat is controlled automatically by our body. So it's controlled by the cardiac center in the brain and also by hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine. So we don't have to worry about telling our heart to beat. That's really important. But it is again an important part of homeostasis, and that has to happen. I don't. It would be interesting if I had you guys in class. I would ask you if any of you have had an EKG, which is just measuring that the beating of your heart and the impulses that are generated, and we look at them to see if it's normal. I've had a couple of EKGs in my life for various reasons, um, and so if it's slightly irregular, a lot of times that's not an issue at all, but sometimes it can be. And as we, they detect a lot more heart defects now, obviously, than they did when I was growing up. But there's a lot more things that they can detect. But this is just kind of what that looks like, that electrical impulse during a heartbeat. And they just look for, is that consistent? Is there a murmur, for example? I'm not going to ask you again to know this, I think, but it's nice overview to have. So electrocardiograms, or we call them sometimes EKGs, but technically, because I think cardio in another language is with a K, and so wherever EKGs first originated, I think cardio starts with a K. So an ECG and EKG are really the same thing. So just measuring. This is always interesting to me. So the atria produce an electrical current stimulated by the SA node called a P wave. So it's a specific type of electrical current that your heart recognizes, and then there's also so there's contraction, obviously, and then there's recovery of the ventricle. Ventricles is called a T wave. So P waves and T waves obviously look a little bit different, and that's what they're looking at in that EKG. So looking at those electrical changes between a P wave and an S wave. And again, we already mentioned some of this. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood back to the heart. Arterioles are just smaller arteries, and we'll see as we go forward, things get smaller and smaller until we get to those fine, thin little capillaries. There's three layers. Epithelial or epithelium tissue is always, whenever we talk about epithelial tissue, it's always tissue that's covering, right? So we have our skin is epithelial tissue. So it has that epithelial tissue, and then a smooth muscle layer, and then the outer layer is actually connective tissue. And I'm not going to have you know any of this. We're just going to move on. This is interesting. So gastric gastric means stomach, or having to do with the stomach. Renal has to do with kidneys. You can take your pulse from the inside of your arm. You're measuring, they call it your brachial pulse, and so on. So I think really interesting things on this diagram, but in the interest of time, you can read that on your own. So just like arteries, veins, which are always returning blood to the heart, so they get blood from those tiny little capillaries that I mentioned, and then they collect in venules, and then it eventually gets pushed into those larger veins, which carry it back to the heart. Again, a thin inner layer of epithelium or epithelial tissue, smooth muscle layer, and the outer layer is connective tissue. just like arteries. Veins carry blood toward the heart. We've mentioned that many times. I don't care about these details. I think that's way more details than we need. Veins carry blood against that carry blood against gravity have valves. You have tons of valves throughout your vein system, and some of you, I don't know for sure exactly why, but my son, and I don't know, he donated a lot of plasma in college, and then when we were doctoring down at Mayo, we could look at the inside of his arms, and we could see actually all of those veins, and maybe as he got thinner too. But we could actually see because when they take blood or put an IV in, they always want to avoid the veins because they're not going to get good blood right there. Like they're not going to get good blood flow for samples, or it's also going to mess with if they're trying to IV something in. So it was just interesting to me that they actually could see his veins. They were pretty obvious when we looked. So anyway, so capillaries are the super tiny little layers here. So we see venules and arterioles. So arteries are pumping blood into these little capillary networks. And then as cell processes occur and it uses up this oxygen, the blood gradually, as it moves through all these little capillaries, and the oxygen diffuses into other areas of the body, other tissues that are not moving around like blood is. And then as that this blood is depleted from oxygen, it moves out of the capillaries into the venules, into the main veins, and back to the heart-lung system. These are some interesting things about, left ventricle versus right ventricle. That kind of, we always think structure and function in living things are super related. So, it's just saying, yeah, the left ventricle is more muscular, and it makes sense because of the function of the left ventricle, where the right ventricle has to pump blood, or the left ventricle has to pump that blood to the entire body. So, of course, that makes sense. Arteries are more muscular than veins because, again, of that pumping structure. And we mentioned before that systolic and diastolic phase. I want to get back to that as far as blood pressure. We kind of mentioned this. So this is just so systolic is the pressure phase, where that heart is, really forcing that blood through arteries. And then that kind of rest phase is the diastolic. So you always measure blood pressure with systolic over diastolic, and 180 is just a very kind of like super normal. If you're athletic, it's going to be lower than that. Some people's naturally runs low. Mine tends to, not because I'm super athletic. It just it just is. And yeah, and so this is just I think of interest. This is kind of that vein system, or those valves that we were looking at. And these are really important because, blood should only flow in one direction. And if it's not flowing just in one direction and you're getting some sort of backswashing, huge problem for us, not very efficient. Blood flow is slower in capillaries. That makes sense. Oopsie, because it splits into from these larger veins into all these, much, much smaller ones. It's a very large network. I don't necessarily care about that. I just want to finish this up today. So veins have helped to increase blood flow. Oh yeah, skeletal muscle contraction plays a part in keeping those veins efficient. This is the formula by which they measure, the rate at which blood is moving through the heart. And that is it for this chapter. So email me with any questions or confusion.